So, I want you to picture the scene, right? It's 336 BC, you're 20 years old, and you're standing in a theater in Macedonia.
Right, which is already a high-stress environment.
Oh, absolutely. But then you literally watch your father, the king, get a dagger shoved through his ribs by his own bodyguard. The crowd just descends into total chaos.
Yeah, complete pandemonium.
Right, and suddenly the most powerful kingdom in the region is completely leaderless. It's teetering on the edge of this massive, bloody civil war. And as a 20-year-old, your very next move decides if you end up on a throne or, in an unmarked grave.
It really is the ultimate crucible. I mean, most people would just flee, or at least take a moment to grieve. But the 20-year-old in this scenario, he doesn't miss a beat. He immediately initiates this ruthless, highly calculated purge of, well, every political rival in the hemisphere.
Just totally wipes the board clean.
Exactly. He secures the throne and then instantly turns his eyes toward the largest empire on Earth.
It's just wild. Well, welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. We are so thrilled you are here with us. Today, we are looking at a massive stack of sources. We're talking ancient biographies, military histories, and even modern logistical research to really decode the life of Alexander the Great.
Yeah, and our mission today isn't just to recount the battles,
Yeah.
The dates and the maps.
Right. No one wants just a textbook reading.
Exactly. We really want to unpack the actual architecture of his mind. How did a 20-year-old pull this off? What is the brutal psychological toll of possessing that kind of limitless ambition?
Yeah, and I think most importantly, we are going to explore this paradox of absolute victory, how the exact traits required to conquer a world are often diametrically opposed to the traits required to actually rule one.
That paradox is so central to his story. Because for centuries, the narrative around Alexander has been obscured by this sort of golden mythic glove.
Well, for sure. He's treated like a demigod.
Right, he's presented as this unstoppable force of nature. But when you really look at the source material closely, you see a deeply human figure who is very deliberately engineered for greatness, piece by piece, from the exact day he was born.
Engineered is the perfect word. You don't just wake up one day and decide to conquer the known world. You are programmed for it. And his parents, King Philip II and Queen Olympias, they basically ran one of the most intense psychological PR campaigns in antiquity.
They really did. It was nonstop.
According to the ancient biographer Plutarch, Olympias claimed that on the eve of her wedding, she dreamt her womb was struck by a thunderbolt. And Philip, he had a dream that he sealed her womb with the emblem of a lion.
Yeah, the messaging there is not exactly subtle. Olympias was essentially building this narrative that Philip wasn't even Alexander's real father, that Alexander was literally the son of Zeus.
Which is a huge thing to drop on a kid.
Oh, absolutely. And historians still debate, whether Olympias genuinely whispered these divine origins to Alexander in private when he was a child, or if Alexander sort of promulgated the myth later on to legitimize his conquest. But either way, the function of the myth is undeniable.
Right, it does a very specific job.
It saddled him with this suffocating, inescapable complex. He was caught between supreme divine confidence on one hand and this desperate, almost frantic need to outdo his incredibly successful human father on the other.
And you see that intellect and that crazy confidence flash really early. There's that famous story from the sources where a horse trader brings this massive, violently aggressive horse to King Philip.
Bucephalus.
Yes, Bucephalus. The horse is just throwing everyone who tries to mount it. Philip is dismissing it as useless, but 10-year-old Alexander is watching all this closely, and he realizes the horse isn't wild, it's terrified. It's actually panicking at the erratic movement of its own shadow on the ground.
Which is such an amazing detail. Alexander just grabs the reins, turns the animal to face directly into the sun so the shadow falls behind it, and calmly mounts. And that same horse carried him all the way to India.
It's incredible.
It is. Philip reportedly wept on the spot and told his son, Macedonia is too small for you.
That is an insane amount of pressure to put on a 10-year-old. And then comes the formal education. Philip doesn't just hire a tutor for him, he hires Aristotle.
Yeah, arguably one of the greatest analytical minds in human history.
Right. He recruits this literal genius to teach his teenager at a boarding school in Mieza. So Alexander is just absorbing medicine, logic, and this deep fundamental belief in Greek cultural superiority.
Yes, and Aristotle also gives him an annotated copy of Homer's Iliad, which the sources say Alexander literally slept with under his pillow.
It's like the ultimate high-pressure prep school.
Exactly. And the Iliad basically gave him his operating system. He modeled himself directly on Achilles. He deeply internalized these Homeric concepts of time and kudos, so honor and glory, believing that a short, blindingly brilliant life was like infinitely more valuable than a long, peaceful one.
Wow.
So Aristotle essentially installed the software, and Philip's military machine provided the hardware.
But all that programming gets stress-tested brutally before he even leaves home, because royal Macedonian politics was essentially a snake pit.
Oh, a total powder keg.
Right. So Philip takes a new, much younger wife named Cleopatra Eurydice. And this is a massive threat to Alexander because his mother, Olympias, was from Epirus, which is a neighboring kingdom. But this new bride is fully Macedonian.
Which brings up the whole issue of pure bloodlines.
Yeah.
And the tension just boils over at the wedding banquet.
Oh, scene is so cinematic.
It really is. The bride's uncle, who is this powerful general named Attalus, he stands up, raises his cup, and prays to the gods that this new union will produce a lawful successor to the kingdom.
Which is just a direct, very public declaration that Alexander is illegitimate.
Yeah, right to his face.
So Alexander just throws his cup at the general's head and screams, "Am I then a bastard?" And King Philip draws his sword and actually charges at his own son.
But he's so intoxicated that he trips and face plants?
Right. And Alexander stands over the most powerful man in Greece and delivers this just devastating line. He says, "See there, the man who makes preparations to pass out of Europe into Asia, overturned and passing from one seat to another."
Ouch. I mean, it's a moment that completely shatters their relationship. Alexander and Olympias actually go into exile for a bit, and this volatile power vacuum is really what sets the stage for the assassination we discussed at the start. So in 336 BC, Philip is murdered by Pausanias, and the throne is suddenly empty.
And see, this is where the idealized romantic image of Alexander the Great completely falls apart for me.
Oh, so?
Well, he doesn't step up and give some unifying speech about democracy or noble ideals. He acts like a ruthless, ancient mob boss. He immediately orders the execution of his cousin. He kills 2 rival princes. He hunts down that general from the wedding banquet.
He really was thorough.
Yeah. And when the Greek city of Thebes tries to use the transition of power to rebel, Alexander marches in, massacres the defenders, levels the entire city to the foundation, and sells the survivors into slavery. I mean, I look at this and I see a tyrant, not a philosophical hero.
It's a very grim reality, for sure. But we really have to understand the mechanics of ancient power here. Macedon wasn't an institutional state where you inherit the throne through like paperwork and bureaucracy. You held the throne purely through the monopoly of violence.
Right. It was a totally different world.
Exactly. If Alexander showed even a fraction of hesitation, the kingdom would have fractured into a dozen warring factions within weeks. So raising Thebes, it was a calculated atrocity. He needed the other Greek city-states to understand on a very visceral level that the new king was far more terrifying than the old one.
And I guess that calculated terror certainly forced Athens and the rest into line. But what's fascinating is that despite all that brutality, he possessed a genuine respect for people who didn't fear him.
Yes, the Diogenes story.
Exactly. Before he invades Asia, he visits Corinth and meets Diogenes the Cynic. Now, Diogenes is this philosopher who literally lives in a barrel on the street. He wears rags, and he completely rejects society's rules. So Alexander, wearing full armor and surrounded by royal guards, asks this philosopher if there is anything in the world he can give him.
And Diogenes just looks at the most dangerous man on earth and says, "Yes, stand a little out of my sunlight."
Which is incredible. Most kings would have him beheaded on the spot for that level of disrespect. But Alexander just laughs and says, "If I were not Alexander, I would like to be Diogenes."
It reveals so much about his psychology, I think. Alexander recognized a mirror image in Diogenes. I mean, both men were chasing absolute freedom.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, because Diogenes achieved it by stripping away all worldly attachments until no one had power over him. But Alexander was trying to achieve it by conquering the entire world until no one had power over him. And he respected the intellectual purity of Diogenes' stance.
That makes a lot of sense. So with the Greek homeland terrified into submission, Alexander turns his attention to his father's ultimate dream, invading the Persian Empire. So in 334 BC, he crosses the Hellespont. And I just want to pause and talk about the sheer logistical nightmare of this.
Oh, the logistics are staggering.
Right. The sources say he brought roughly 48,000 soldiers and 6,000 cavalry. When we read that number, it just sounds like a statistic in a book. But think about the caloric intake required to keep 50,000 men and thousands of horses alive while marching across deserts and mountains.
Yeah, an army of that size consumes hundreds of tons of grain and water every single day. And the Persian strategy initially was just scorched earth-like, burn the crops, poison the wells, and let the Macedonians starve.
So how did he counter that?
Through aggressive speed. He moved his army faster than anyone in antiquity thought was even possible. He was constantly capturing Persian supply depots right before they could be destroyed, and he made sure to secure coastal cities so his navy could drop off fresh supplies.
Wow, so he was essentially outrunning starvation. And that speed translates directly to his battlefield tactics, too, because the Persian Empire had armies that vastly outnumbered him. So instead of fighting a long war of attrition, he relied on an incredibly specific technological advantage, which was a Macedonian phalanx.
Right, the phalanx was the anchor of his entire strategy. So while the Persian infantry were largely equipped with shorter weapons, javelins and these wicker shields, the Macedonians carried something called the sarissa.
And the sarissa is a spear that is up to 20 feet long.
Yes, 20 feet.
Like if you arrange thousands of men in a tight block, row after row, holding these massive pikes, it creates this impenetrable wall of sharp wood and iron. The Persians literally could not get close enough to swing a sword without being impaled.
Exactly. But the thing is, the phalanx wasn't actually designed to kill the enemy quickly. It was designed to pin them in place. It was basically an immovable anvil.
Ah, right.
And the hammer was Alexander himself. While the infantry held the center, Alexander would personally lead the elite companion cavalry on the right wing.
Right in the thick of it.
Yes. He would bait the Persian lines into stretching out, wait for this microscopic gap to open in their formation, and then he'd drive a wedge of heavy cavalry straight through that gap, aiming directly for the Persian king, Darius III.
He did this at the major battles of Granicus, Aetius, and Gaugamela, right? It's almost like a form of lateral thinking. I mean, he's like a disruptive startup taking down a massive corporate monopoly. He realized he didn't need to kill 100,000 Persian soldiers. He just needed to terrify one single man.
Exactly. The moment King Darius panicked and fled the battlefield, the entire Persian command structure collapsed. The army would just rout. It's very much like the famous story of the Gordian knot.
Oh, that is the perfect metaphor for his entire methodology.
Yeah, could you explain that one for the listeners?
Yeah, so he's in the city of Gordium, and there's this ancient, incredibly complex knot tying an ox cart to a post. And the local prophecy says whoever can untie it will rule all of Asia. So for centuries, people have been trying to unravel it and just failing.
It was supposed to be an impossible puzzle.
Exactly. So Alexander walks up, studies it, realizes it's a rigged game, draws his sword, and just hacks the knot in half. He doesn't play by the rules of the puzzle. He breaks the paradigm of the puzzle entirely.
And we see that exact same paradigm-breaking adaptability later in the campaign, too. Like, when he reaches the Hydaspes River in India, he faces King Porus. Now, Porus brings a weapon the Macedonians had no real answer for, which was hundreds of war elephants.
Right, because you cannot pin an angry elephant with a 20-foot spear. It will just crush the phalanx.
It'll snap the spears like twigs.
So Alexander just completely rewrites his playbook on the fly. Instead of holding a rigid wall, he orders his infantry to do something totally counterintuitive. When the elephants charge, the Macedonian ranks intentionally split open.
Yeah, they just create lanes.
Yes, allowing these massive beasts to run straight through the army. And as the elephants pass by, the soldiers use those long spears to strike upward, targeting the handlers on top and the unarmored sides of the animals.
It's just brilliant tactical agility. But this is exactly where the narrative takes a really dark turn.
How so?
Because destroying an enemy army requires one specific set of skills, right? Violence, disruption, and speed. But ruling the vast, complex empire you just conquered requires the exact opposite. It requires stability, compromise, and institution building. Alexander excelled at the former, but he struggled deeply with the latter.
And that is the core paradox of this deep dive. I mean, here's where it gets really interesting. You win the war, you sit on the Persian throne in Babylon, which, by the way, the sources say the throne was so big, Alexander's feet were dangling in the air until a servant slid a little table underneath them.
Which is quite an image.
Right. But suddenly you realize you have to govern millions of people who don't speak your language and view you as a hostile invader. So what do?
Well, to solve this, Alexander began to adopt Persian customs. He understood that he couldn't rule an empire spanning from Egypt to India solely with Macedonian garrisons. It just wasn't feasible. He needed the local nobility to accept him.
So it was a PR move?
Partially, yes.
Yeah.
So he started wearing Persian royal robes, he appointed Persian satraps to govern the provinces, and he organized this massive ceremony at Susa, basically forcing his top Macedonian generals to marry Persian noblewomen. She was attempting to literally breed a new, unified ruling class.
Which, I mean, makes sense politically, but the cultural friction back home was immense. The breaking point for his Greek soldiers was this Persian court ritual called proskynesis.
Ah, yes, proskynesis.
Right, for the Persians, blowing a kiss or bowing before the king was just, standard respect for the office. But for the Greeks and Macedonians, bowing was strictly reserved for the gods. So to demand that a free Macedonian soldier bow to a human king was deeply, deeply degrading.
And it really begs the question of whether Alexander was just employing a brilliant, calculated PR strategy, or if he was genuinely beginning to believe his own mother's propaganda that he was actually a living god.
I mean, he was declared the son of Amun in Egypt, right?
Right, and depicted with horns on coins. And the psychological toll of that unending absolute power really began to erode his sanity. The paranoia just set in. When he uncovered a relatively minor plot against his life, he didn't just execute the conspirator. He ordered the assassination of Parmenion, who was his oldest, most reliable general, simply to prevent any potential retaliation.
It's just wild. The atmosphere in his inner circle becomes totally toxic, and it culminates in this horrific incident at a banquet. So everyone is heavily drinking, which was pretty standard for the Macedonian court. And Cletus the Black, who is this veteran commander who literally saved Alexander's life by chopping off a Persian soldier's arm at the Battle of Granicus. He starts arguing with the king.
Right, they get into a massive fight.
Yeah, Cletus tells Alexander he's forgotten his roots, that his achievements belong to the Macedonian army, not to some Persian god king.
And Alexander's reaction is explosive.
Oh, yeah.
He grabs a spear from a guard and drives it straight through Cletus, killing him instantly.
The man who saved his life.
Yes. The sources say Alexander was instantly overcome with profound remorse. He locked himself in his tent and refused to eat for days. But, the damage was permanent. The man who had mastered the art of war had completely lost mastery of himself.
And you also see this impulsive destruction in the burning of Persepolis, right?
Yeah.
The magnificent Persian capital, hundreds of years of art and architecture just torched to the ground.
Yeah, some sources claim he was goaded into it by a companion named Thais during a drunken revelry, and that he actually tried to order the fires put out the next morning when he sobered up.
But again, it just shows the frayed edges of a mind pushed way beyond human limits. Which brings us to the moment the unstoppable force finally hits an immovable object.
And that object wasn't an enemy army. It was his own men. So in 326 BC, after nearly a decade of continuous marching and fighting, the army reaches the Hyphasis River, which is known today as the Bees, in the Indian subcontinent. And the soldiers simply stop.
Just put yourself in the sandals of a Macedonian infantryman for a second. You've walked thousands of miles from home. The monsoon rains have been pouring for 70 straight days. Your armor is rusted. Your clothes are literally rotting off your body, and you are surrounded by venomous snakes and tropical diseases.
That's utter misery.
Right. You just barely survived a horrific battle against 200 war elephants. And now the scouts are bringing back reports about what lies across the river.
Yeah, the scouts reported the existence of the Nanda Empire. And the numbers they brought back shattered whatever Macedonian morale was left.
What were the numbers?
They spoke of a standing army of 200,000 infantry, 80,000 cavalry, and most terrifying of all, up to 6,000 war elephants waiting for them.
6,000. A veteran general named Calenus finally steps forward, and he pleads with Alexander. He essentially says, "We have given you everything. We are covered in scars. Let us go home and see our families before we die."
And Alexander throws a tantrum. He sulks in his tent for 3 days, just waiting for the men to change their minds.
Like a child.
Exactly. But the silence in the camp is deafening. For the first time in his entire life, the sheer force of his will is not enough. He finally concedes and orders the march back to Babylon.
And Babylon was intended to be the capital of his new integrated global empire, right?
Yes. He spent months planning new expeditions. And an invasion of Arabia, building 1,000 ships to conquer North Africa. Yeah. But his body was failing. He had sustained horrific wounds over the years, including an arrow that actually punctured his lung.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he was drinking heavily. And he was emotionally devastated by the recent death of his closest companion, Hephaestion.
So in June of 323 BC, at just 32 years old, after a night of heavy drinking, Alexander develops a sudden fever. Within days, he is completely paralyzed, unable to even speak. And the cause of death is still ancient history's greatest cold case.
It really is.
Was it malaria? Typhoid. Did a rival spike his wine with white hellebore or toxic bacteria from a stagnant river?
The exact pathology remains a mystery, but the outcome was catastrophic. As he lay dying, his generals crowded around his bed, desperate for instructions. They asked him who this vast empire should be left to. And according to legend, Alexander managed to whisper 2 words. Toi kratistoi, which means to the strongest.
To the strongest, really. I mean, it is such a cinematic line, but practically, isn't that the most disastrous thing a dying king could possibly say? Didn't that essentially guarantee that his generals would immediately tear his empire apart the second he died?
Oh, absolutely. He didn't name an heir. He didn't establish a transitional government. He basically just threw a piece of meat to a pack of starving wolves.
Wow.
And the wolves immediately tore the empire apart. His generals, known as the Diadochi, spent the next 40 years fighting brutal civil wars over the territory. Alexander's mother, his wives, and his young children were all eventually assassinated in the power struggle.
That is incredibly bleak.
Yeah, his grand plans for forced cultural integration and new conquests were completely abandoned. Politically, his empire died the exact moment he did.
But his cultural impact didn't die. And this is where we have to look at the Hellenistic period. Because the transcript of history didn't just reset to the way things were before he crossed the Hellespont.
Far from it. The political state fractured, but a massive unified cultural sphere was born. Alexander had seeded Greek culture deeply into Asia and the Middle East. He founded over 20 cities, many named Alexandria, with the one in Egypt becoming the intellectual capital of the ancient world.
Think about what that actually looked like on the ground for everyday people. You suddenly have Greek gymnasiums and theaters popping up in modern-day Afghanistan. You have a shared language, Koine Greek, acting as the connective tissue for trade and science across thousands of miles.
Yes, and later, you even see the rise of Greco-Buddhism in India.
Oh, right.
You get statues of the Buddha wearing Greek-style togas, heavily influenced by the artistic traditions Alexander's army left behind. It was a chaotic, often violent merging of worlds, but it laid the groundwork for the Roman Empire and ultimately deeply influenced the trajectory of Western civilization.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what is the ultimate insight you can take away from all this? When we strip away the myth of the thunderbolt and the undefeated record, what is the lesson of Alexander?
I believe it's a masterclass in the dual nature of ambition. On one hand, Alexander is the ultimate proof that rigorous intellect, supreme lateral thinking, and an unwavering belief in your own capability can allow you to achieve the genuinely impossible.
But it's also a profound warning, right? The skills required to conquer the world, ruthlessness, perpetual forward motion, breaking all the rules, are completely toxic when it comes time to actually rule, build, and maintain a life.
Precisely. He destroyed the very people who helped him rise because he couldn't turn the conqueror off. He thought he was a god, but his biology and his army's psychology were strictly human. The boundless ambition that built his legacy was the exact same mechanism that ensured his empire would collapse the moment he closed his eyes.
It is a devastating paradox, and we want to leave you with one final, lingering thought to ponder on your own. Think back to that rain-soaked mutiny at the Bees River. His exhausted, terrified men forced him to turn back. But what if they hadn't?
It's fascinating. What if?
If Alexander had managed to convince them to take just one more step forward, and they had actually marched into the heart of India to face the 200,000 soldiers and thousands of war elephants of the massive Nanda Empire, would his intellect have found a way to rewrite the rules of war yet again? Or would history's greatest undefeated tactician have finally met his ultimate bloody end in the mud? Imagine being 20 years old. Your father has just been assassinated at this massive public gathering. Your family is totally fractured by recent exiles. The alliances holding your whole country together are crumbling. And, you are basically surrounded by rival nations just waiting for you to fail so they can carve up your homeland.
Yeah, it's an absolute nightmare scenario for most people.
Right. I mean, most people would hide, or at least try to negotiate some kind of quiet surrender. But the person we are exploring today used that exact chaos to conquer the known world by the time he was 30.
It really remains one of history's most staggering transformations. Like, if you were to look at a sprawling ancient map of the Mediterranean and Asia in 336 BC, and then look at it again just a decade later, the borders are almost unrecognizable.
Oh, completely.
Because Alexander the Great was undefeated in battle. He created this massive empire that stretched from Greece all the way to northwestern India.
And that is exactly the mission for this deep dive. For you listening, we want to bypass the ancient myth-making today. We are going to extract the actual strategies, the psychological tactics, and the brutal leadership lessons from his life.
Yeah, because there's so much to learn there.
Exactly. We want to treat this not just as ancient history, but really as a masterclass in ambition, adaptation, and just the absolute limits of human endurance. So, okay, let's unpack this.
To figure out how someone builds an empire that quickly, we really have to look at the incredibly unique incubator of his childhood. This all starts in Pella, in 356 BC. He was born to King Philip II of Macedon and Queen Olympias.
Now, I've read there's some pretty wild mythology surrounding his actual birth, something about a major temple burning down on the exact same day.
Oh yeah, the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, which, by the way, was literally one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It just happened to burn to the ground the exact day he was born.
Wow, just a coincidence.
Well, yes, but decades later, the propaganda spin put on this event was that the goddess Artemis was, so busy attending Alexander's birth in Macedon that she actually let her own temple burn.
That is some serious spin.
Right. But what's fascinating here is how this early environment perfectly balanced sheer military pragmatism with a profound sense of divine destiny.
How did those two influences actually play out in his daily education, like nature versus nurture?
So from his father, Philip, Alexander learned the brutal, practical realities of statecraft. Philip was busy revolutionizing the Macedonian army into this highly professional fighting force.
Okay, so very grounded, very tactical.
Exactly. But then from his mother, Olympias, he absorbed this unshakable belief that he was actually superhuman. She deeply encouraged the idea that he was the son of Zeus, that he was destined for absolute greatness.
It's quite the childhood expectation.
It really is. And Philip spared no expense on his education either. He turned the royal court at Mieza into basically an elite boarding school for Alexander and the children of the Macedonian nobles. The boys who would eventually become his generals.
Oh, right, building the inner circle early.
Yep. And Philip hired Aristotle to be their tutor.
Okay, just imagine having one of the foundational philosophers of Western thought as your high school teacher. Did Aristotle's teachings actually translate to his leadership style later on?
Absolutely they did. Aristotle gave him an annotated copy of Homer's Iliad, which Alexander became totally obsessed with. He actually carried it with him on all his campaigns.
Just keeping it in his tent, right?
Yeah, under his pillow, according to some accounts. But beyond just literature, he developed this intense, almost analytical power of observation. There's a famous story of the horse, Bucephalus.
Oh, I love this story.
Yeah, so a trader brought this massive, beautiful horse to Philip, asking 13 talents for it.
Wait, really quick, what does 13 talents actually mean in modern terms? Just to give some scale.
Sure, so a single talent was roughly the weight of a man in silver. So 13 talents was a staggering fortune. We are talking effectively millions of dollars today.
Okay, wow, that's a very expensive horse.
But the horse was entirely feral. It wouldn't let anyone mount it. It was violently bucking off the most skilled riders they had. So Philip, being highly practical and, not wanting to waste time or money, ordered the horse sent away.
But Alexander, who is just a kid at this point, he notices something the veterans completely missed.
He did.
The horse wasn't just wild, it was terrified of its own shadow moving on the ground. So he runs out, turns the horse to face the sun to eliminate the shadow, and mounts it perfectly.
It's a brilliant moment.
It's such a great story because, it reminds me of a junior team member noticing a really simple one-line bug in the software code that the senior engineers completely missed because they were just trying to apply brute force logic. It really highlights observation over sheer force.
I think that's a perfect analogy. And not only does it show observation, but it secured his father's deep respect. Philip reportedly wept with joy and told his son, "You must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedon is too small for you."
No pressure.
Right. And really, it's a prompt for you, listening right now, to consider how your own early mentors shaped your trajectory. Did they give you the practical tools to succeed, or did they set the bar impossibly high? In Alexander's case, it was definitely both.
So his childhood is this incredible masterclass in preparation. But actually getting to the throne wasn't a peaceful handover at all. How does a young prince navigate a system that is actively turning against him?
Well, it started with a catastrophic family rift in 338 BC. Philip decided to take a new wife, a much younger woman named Cleopatra Eurydice.
Okay.
And Alexander's mother, Olympias, was from Epirus, which was a neighboring kingdom. This meant a child from this new marriage would be a fully Macedonian heir. which seriously threatened Alexander's claim to the throne.
And that leads to a famous confrontation at the wedding banquet, right?
Yeah, a deeply tense one, yeah. The new bride's uncle, Atlas, stands up while heavily intoxicated and publicly prays to the gods that this new union will produce a lawful successor to the kingdom.
Wow. So he was effectively calling Alexander an illegitimate bastard in front of the entire Macedonian nobility.
Exactly. It was a huge insult. Alexander throws a cup at Atlas. Philip, in a drunken rage, draws his sword and literally charges at his own son.
But Philip trips and falls flat on his face, and Alexander just looks down at him and delivers this legendary line. He says, "See there, the man who makes preparations to pass out of Europe into Asia, overturned in passing from one seat to another." I mean, that is just ice in his veins.
It really is. And, well, it resulted in Alexander and Olympias fleeing into exile for a while. They eventually reconciled with Philip, but the trust was permanently broken.
I can imagine.
Yeah. Then 2 years later, in 336 BC, at another wedding in the capital, Philip is suddenly assassinated by the captain of his own bodyguards, a man named Pausanias.
Okay, so given the incredibly convenient timing of this and, knowing Olympias's ruthless reputation, is it possible Alexander was quietly involved in his own father's assassination?
It remains one of history's great cold cases, honestly. The ancient texts document all sorts of theories involving rival nobles, Persian spies, or even Alexander and Olympias pulling the strings behind the scenes.
It wouldn't be surprising.
No, it wouldn't. But the crucial takeaway isn't just who held the dagger. It's how Alexander reacted. He didn't pause to mourn. He weaponized the assassination instantly.
But wait, how does a 20-year-old convince hardened veteran generals to just let him take over without a massive civil war breaking out? Like, what is the actual mechanism there?
He secured the loyalty in the army before anyone else could even react. He immediately promised to maintain Philip's foreign policies, and, crucially, he abolished personal taxes.
Buying loyalty. Smart.
Very smart. With the army backing him, he moved with terrifying speed to execute potential rivals to the throne. Olympias even had Philip's new wife and her infant child murdered. Extremely. And when the Greek city-state of Thebes tried to rebel, thinking, this young new king was vulnerable, Alexander didn't just defeat their army. He razed the entire city to the ground and sold the survivors into slavery.
Wow. So he rules entirely through fear and quick consolidation early on, but keeping a throne is very different from ruling a global empire. How does he convince this newly unified army to actually follow him into the Persian Empire, which was, the superpower of the day?
Well, he leans into his father's ultimate goal of invading Persia, but he adds his own incredible theatrical flair to it.
Of course he does.
Right. When he crosses the Hellespont into Asia in 334 BC, he stands at the front of his ship in full armor. As they approach the shore, he literally throws a spear into the Asian soil, claiming the entire continent as a spear-won gift from the gods.
It just sets the tone immediately, and we see his unique approach to problem-solving shortly after that, too, with the legend of the Gordian knot.
Yes. So in the Phrygian capital of Gordium, there was this ancient, incredibly complex knot tying a chariot to a pole. And a local prophecy stated that whoever could untie it would be the king of Asia.
And dozens had tried and failed over the years, right?
Exactly. For a long time, no one can figure it out.
So Alexander looks at it, realizes the rules are completely rigged, and just pulls out his sword and hacks the knot to pieces. And, here's where it gets really interesting for me. Because this is the ultimate industry disruption moment.
How so?
Well, it goes deeper than just breaking a rule. He realized the game itself was an illusion constructed by his predecessors. It's exactly like a disruptive modern startup looking at a really entrenched industry and realizing that, legacy supply chains or traditional retail models are optional, not mandatory. He just refuses to solve the problem on their terms.
That's a great way to look at it. And he applies that exact same disruptive geometry to the battlefield, too. At the battles of Granicus and Issus, he faced massive Persian armies that vastly outnumbered his own. But he used the terrain to funnel them, and he leaned heavily on the Macedonian phalanx.
Can you explain how the phalanx actually worked? Why was it so devastating against a bigger army?
Sure. A phalanx was a densely packed block of infantry. But Philip and Alexander armed them with the sarissa, which was a spear that was up to 20 feet long.
20 feet?
Yeah, massive. And because the spears were so long, the spear points of the first 5 rows of men all protruded past the front line. It created this impenetrable wall of wood and bronze. The Persians were using much shorter swords and javelins. They literally couldn't get close enough to strike a Macedonian soldier without being impaled.
So the mechanics of the battlefield were completely tilted in his favor from the start. But military dominance is one thing. How does he manage the psychology of conquering these very distinct ancient cultures?
He understood psychological dominance perfectly. After taking the Mediterranean coast, he enters Egypt and is actually hailed as a liberator. But then he takes a dangerous detour deep into the desert to visit the oracle at the Siwa oasis.
Right, I've heard of this.
Yeah, and there, the high priest proclaims him the son of the deity Amun. From that point on, Alexander frequently refers to himself as the son of Zeus Amun.
A total divine rebrand.
Exactly.
And that psychological warfare extends to how he handled the Persian royal identity later on, too.
Yes, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, Alexander wasn't just conquering land. He was attempting to conquer the very idea of legitimacy. When he finally captured Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, the Eastern Palace burned to the ground.
Was that on purpose?
Well, some sources say it was a drunken accident, instigated as revenge for the Persians burning Athens decades earlier. But others argue it was a deeply calculated statement to show the old empire was dead. Because shortly after that, as he pushed deeper and found the Persian king Darius dead, Alexander claimed the Achaemenid throne, the historic Persian royal dynasty, for himself.
And he starts adopting their customs, right? Which causes massive internal friction with his own guys.
Huge friction. He started wearing Persian royal dress. He even tried to introduce the Persian court custom of proskynesis, which meant making his subjects bow or prostrate themselves before him when they entered his presence.
Which his Greek generals would have absolutely hated, because to the Greeks you only bow to gods, not mortal men.
Exactly. It was a massive cultural miscalculation on his part. He was trying to merge two vastly different cultures to manage an unprecedentedly large empire, but in doing so, he alienated the very men who had bled to help him build it. They really thought he was losing his mind, literally playing God.
So the internal tension is just building and building, but outwardly he just keeps pushing. I mean, he wants to go beyond the Persian Empire. He literally marches his army into India.
Yeah, and the Indian campaign was incredibly grueling. At the Battle of the Hydaspes, he faces King Porus, who utilizes an army of war elephants.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it's completely alien and terrifying to the Macedonian horses and the infantry.
I mean, how do you fight a living tank when all you have are spears?
Alexander adapts again. He orders his phalanx to open their ranks, basically letting the elephants charge right through the gaps. Once the elephants are surrounded, the Macedonians use those massive 20-foot sarissas to strike upward, targeting the elephant handlers and the unarmored parts of the animals.
It's brilliant tactical pivoting on the fly. But even with victories like that, they eventually hit a wall at the Bees River, don't they?
They do. Word spreads through the ranks that just across the river, the massive Nanda empires are waiting for them. We're talking rumors of 200,000 fresh foot soldiers and thousands of war elephants.
That's just overwhelming.
And Alexander's men are exhausted. I mean, they have been marching, fighting, and bleeding for a decade, thousands of miles away from home.
And this leads to a mutiny. His general, Coenus, actually steps up and begs him to turn back, telling Alexander the men just want to see their families and their homeland again.
You know, it makes me think of extreme corporate burnout today.
Oh, that's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, like you have this visionary CEO who is just obsessed with breaking into a massive new global market, but the ground team is utterly exhausted. They haven't slept in months, and they simply refuse to write another line of code. They are just done.
That's exactly what it was. And the crucial leadership lesson here is that visionary stamina is not transferable. You just cannot force an army or workforce to infinitely care about a milestone they didn't help design.
Right.
Alexander was an absolute master at reading the psychology of his enemies, but at the Bees River, it becomes incredibly clear he completely failed to read his own men. He was finally forced to yield and give the order to turn back. And that pivot backwards seems to be the catalyst for his entire collapse. I mean, the final years shift so rapidly from glorious conquest to just paranoia and internal decay.
And they really do. On the journey back, he decides to march a portion of his army through the Gedrosian Desert in southern Iran.
Why would he choose a desert route? Like, was it a logistical necessity?
Not really. Historians largely believe it was a mix of intense hubris and retaliation. He wanted to achieve something previous legendary conquerors had failed to do by crossing it. But many also believe he was quietly punishing his army for the mutiny at the river.
That is incredibly petty.
And the result was a catastrophic mistake. The heat and the complete lack of water led to the deaths of tens of thousands of his own people. He lost more men there than he ever lost in a single battle.
Wow. And when he finally makes it back to Persia, the personal blows just start landing. His closest companion, his best friend Hephaestion, suddenly dies of an illness. And Alexander is completely devastated. This grief just accelerates this creeping megalomania.
Yes, his violent outbursts become completely unpredictable. During a drunken argument, he personally murders Clitus the Black.
Wait, wasn't he an old friend?
He was the veteran officer who had literally saved his life at his very first battle in Asia.
That is just tragic.
And it gets worse. He also executes his top general Parmenion and Parmenion's son over a suspected assassination plot, acting purely on paranoia.
The atmosphere in his inner circle must have been absolutely terrifying at that point. And then in 323 BC, while he's in Babylon planning an invasion of Arabia, Alexander suddenly falls ill and dies at the age of 32. What actually happened?
Well, the accounts are heavily debated. The ancient historian Plutarch claims it was a slow fever that developed after a night of heavy drinking, gradually paralyzing him over nearly 2 weeks until he couldn't even speak.
Okay, that's one version.
Right. But Diodorus, another historian, describes Alexander being struck by a sudden agonizing pain after downing a large bowl of unmixed wine.
Which has naturally fueled centuries of poison theories.
Exactly. And there's a compelling modern theory from toxicologists suggesting it could have been white hellebore, which is the veratrum album plant.
Yeah.
It was known in antiquity to induce vomiting, but in large, concentrated doses, it causes a slow, agonizing death that perfectly matches the historical accounts of his lingering decline.
That's terrifying.
It is. But whether it was typhoid fever, malaria, or a poisoned cup of wine, the result was a catastrophic power vacuum. On his deathbed, when asked who should inherit this massive, newly forged empire, he supposedly whispered, "Tui kratistoi," to the strongest.
So what does this all mean? Was that line, "to the strongest," just an act of ultimate arrogance, like a leader so obsessed with his own singularity that he refused to let anyone else step into his shoes?
This raises an important question about how we fundamentally define a successful leader. Because on one hand, Alexander spread Greek culture, language, and architecture from the Mediterranean to the Himalayas, a process known as Hellenization. He was literally laying the cultural groundwork for the next 1,000 years.
Right, the cultural impact is undeniable.
But as a state builder, he failed completely. He built no lasting bureaucratic institutions. He cultivated no clear successor. And because of that, his empire shattered into pieces the very moment he stopped breathing. It launched 40 years of brutal civil wars among his generals, which is a period known as the Diadochi.
Yeah, so he was a master tactician and a brilliant opportunist, absolutely. But his life is also a glaring cautionary tale about unchecked ambition, which, brings us back to you, the listener. It really makes you look at your own projects and your leadership style. Are you building something that relies entirely on your personal energy and charisma to survive? Or are you actually building a structural system that can outlast you when you step away?
It is the stark difference between being a lightning strike and building a foundation.
Yeah.
And Alexander was the lightning.
Exactly. And to leave you with one final kind of mind-bending thought about the sheer scale of that lightning. Before he died, Alexander left behind what Diodorus recorded as his last plans.
Oh, these are wild.
They are unbelievable. If he had recovered from that fever, he was actually preparing to build 1,000 massive ships to conquer Carthage and the Western Mediterranean. He wanted to construct pyramids in Europe to rival the ones in Egypt.
Yeah.
And most incredibly, he planned to artificially transplant entire populations, moving massive groups of people from Asia to Europe and Europe to Asia, basically to force global unity through intermarriage.
It was a vision of forced globalization on an ancient, totally unprecedented scale.
Yeah. Alexander isn't just a clean, impressive line on a historical map showing a conquered empire. He is the ultimate chaotic image of human potential and destruction just wrapped into one. Just imagine what the modern world would look like today if a 32-year-old Alexander the Great had actually survived that fever in Babylon to force that terrifying, incredible vision into existence.
Usually when we talk about, history's most successful leaders, there's this expectation of a long, gradual climb.
Yeah, steady accumulation of power over decades.
Right, like you picture this gray-haired statesman carefully moving pieces on a chessboard over an entire lifetime.
Exactly, a slow burn. We naturally expect experience, careful calculation, and above all, a lot of patience from anyone who builds an empire.
Which is why looking at the ancient world could be so jarring. because suddenly you see that chessboard just completely flipped over. We are looking at a historical landscape redefined by someone who didn't even live to see his 33rd birthday.
It is the absolute definition of a historical supernova, a massive, blinding explosion of ambition that changes the gravity of everything around it and then is just, well, suddenly gone.
Welcome to this deep dive. Our mission today isn't just to gaze at the shiny armor of a legendary conqueror. We are pulling from a comprehensive historical and biographical text to figure out the how and the why. Like, how did a 20-year-old manage to conquer the known world?
And how he handled the intense, mind-breaking pressure of ruling a vastly diverse empire.
Exactly. And why his psychological unraveling is just as fascinating as his military victories.
Because the logistics of his conquests are undeniably incredible. But the psychology of the conqueror, that's where the most potent insights are hidden in our source material.
Yeah, and whether you, listening right now, are managing a massive project at work, leading a diverse team, or just struggling with your own ambition and burnout, Alexander's life is the ultimate case study in the dazzling heights and the catastrophic dangers of unchecked drive.
It really is.
So to understand that drive, we have to look at the foundational ingredients that created this unstoppable force. He was born in Pella in 356 BC to King Philip II of Macedon and his principal wife, Olympias. But the myth-making didn't wait for him to actually achieve anything.
Oh no, it started before he was even born. According to ancient biographers like Plutarch, on the eve of consummating her marriage to Philip, Olympias dreamed her womb was struck by a thunderbolt.
A literal thunderbolt.
Yeah, that caused a flame to spread far and wide. And Philip supposedly had a corresponding dream where he sealed her womb with an engraved lion's image.
And the ancient commentators were already spinning this into gold, right? Like, was Olympias already pregnant? Was the father actually Zeus? There's even a story that on the exact day he was born, the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, which is one of the 7 wonders of the world, burnt to the ground.
Right, one ancient writer actually claimed the temple burned because the goddess Artemis was away, personally attending Alexander's birth.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And what's crucial to understand here is the psychological conditioning this environment creates. These legends may have emerged later, possibly at Alexander's own instigation, to prove he was superhuman. But he was raised by a mother who instilled in him a profound, literal sense of divine destiny.
And then on the other side, you have his father, Philip. On the very day Alexander was born, Philip receives news of major military victories and his horses winning at the Olympic Games.
So no pressure at all for the kid.
Right, zero pressure.
Alexander's relationship with Philip forged this intensely competitive, almost anxious side of his personality. He developed a deep-seated need to outdo his father's achievements. Our sources mention he was actually worried his father would conquer so much that he'd leave him no great or brilliant achievement to be displayed to the world.
And his education is just as extreme as his parentage. The lengths Philip went to for this kid's schooling.
Oh, it's wild. When Alexander was 13, Philip considered a few prominent academics for a tutor before settling on Aristotle. He gave them the Temple of the Nymphs at Mieza to use as a classroom. And the tuition fee Philip paid is just astonishing.
Wait, I remember this.
Yeah, in exchange for teaching his son, Philip agreed to rebuild Aristotle's hometown, a town Philip himself had previously razed to the ground.
And free all of its enslaved ex-citizens. Okay, let's unpack this for a second. That is an insane tuition fee. To put this in perspective for you listening, imagine having Albert Einstein teach you high school physics, and in exchange, your dad just casually rebuilds a destroyed city while running a global superpower.
It's unbelievable leverage.
And Aristotle teaches him medicine, philosophy, logic, and gives him an annotated copy of Homer's Iliad that Alexander literally carries with him on his military campaigns. But there's also the physical conditioning.
Right. The most famous example from his youth is the taming of Bucephalus. At age 10, a trader brings this massive wild horse that no seasoned handler can ride. It's terrified and violent.
But Alexander observes something the adults missed, right?
Exactly. The horse is simply afraid of its own shadow. So he turns the horse toward the sun, calms it, and successfully rides it. Philip reportedly wept with pride, telling him, "Macedon is too small for you."
It's a great story, but I'm going to push back a little here. Was Alexander actually this once-in-a-generation genius from childhood, or was he just the product of the most expensive, highly curated education and PR campaign in antiquity?
Well, it's a vital question to ask of the source material. The PR was undeniably massive. But when we look at what he actually did when he was thrust into power, the evidence points to a genuine, albeit deeply ruthless, capability. He was highly analytical.
So we have this heavily curated education and a brilliant PR campaign. But that bubble pops pretty violently when he hits 20.
That is when curated education meets brutal reality. His father, Philip II, had just built an incredible military machine, united most of Greece under the League of Corinth, and was preparing to invade the Persian Empire. But at a wedding, Philip is assassinated by his own bodyguard, Pausanias.
And news of Philip's death instantly triggers revolts all over the region. Thebes, Athens, Thessaly, the Thracian tribes, they all see an opportunity to shake off Macedonian control.
Yeah, and Alexander is proclaimed king on the spot, and he responds with terrifying speed. He doesn't hold counsel, he doesn't negotiate, he immediately secures power through blood.
Right, executing potential rivals like his cousin Amyntas IV and his stepmother's uncle Attalus.
And when the city of Thebes decides to rebel, he doesn't just defeat their army, he razes the entire city to the ground.
Obliterates it.
Total destruction. It was a calculated display of terror. Obliterating an ancient, respected city like Thebes completely shocked the rest of Greece into absolute submission.
Yet, amidst this calculated brutality, he has these moments of bizarre philosophical clarity. Like, before heading to Asia, he's in Corinth, and he meets Diogenes the Cynic.
Yeah.
The famous philosopher who gave away all his possessions and lived in a barrel on the street.
Yeah, Alexander, now the most powerful man in Greece, walks up to Diogenes and asks if there's anything he can do for him. And Diogenes looks up and basically says, yes, stand a little out of my son.
Just completely dismissive.
Completely. And instead of executing him for the disrespect, Alexander is delighted by the audacity. He reportedly says, if I were not Alexander, I would like to be Diogenes.
It's almost like Aristotle's tutelage wasn't completely lost on it. I mean, he could appreciate profound intellectual independence even as he was preparing to conquer the world. Because he doesn't linger in Corinth. He takes the army his father built and crosses the Hellespont into Asia in 334 BC.
Which initiates his massive campaign against the sprawling Persian Empire. But wait, didn't he just inherit a perfectly oiled military machine? I mean, Philip is basically the founder of a tech startup who spends years in the garage doing all the grueling back-end engineering. Then Alexander steps in as the aggressive new CEO, takes the company public, and gets his face on all the magazine covers.
The tech startup analogy is remarkably apt, actually. Philip absolutely built the machine. He revolutionized warfare by creating the Macedonian phalanx.
With those massive spears, right?
Yeah, the sarissa. It was a terrifying double-pointed spear that was 18 to 20 feet long. Philip also developed the heavy cavalry tactics to complement them. But Alexander was the CEO who knew how to scale that operation globally under extreme life-or-death pressure.
And we see that scaling immediately at his first major battle in Asia, the Battle of Granicus. He's facing a Persian force of roughly 40,000, but he only has about 13,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. This is where his tactical spatial awareness really shines. Alexander uses the terrain in his troop deployment masterfully. He places his heavily armed phalanx in the center and his elite cavalry on the wings. Because the Persian commanders line their cavalry up at the riverbank with their infantry stuck behind them?
A huge mistake.
A fatal mistake. Alexander ensures his smaller force can't be outflanked. The massive length of those 20-foot sarissas absolutely shreds the shorter Persian weapons.
And he never just sits on a hill safely watching the battle unfold either. He leads from the front. At the Battle of Assus, which is his first direct confrontation with the Persian king, Darius III, Alexander personally leads the cavalry charge, forming a wedge that drives right into the center of the Persian line.
The psychological impact of seeing the enemy king charging directly at you is devastating. Darius literally loses his nerve and flees the battlefield in his chariot.
And the entire Persian command structure collapses in panic. I mean, Darius flees so fast he leaves behind his own mother, his wife, his daughters, and a massive portion of the royal treasury.
It's a total rout.
Darius even tries to negotiate a peace treaty later, offering to cede vast territories and pay a huge ransom. And Alexander sends a letter back, essentially saying that he is now the king of Asia and he alone decides how the world is divided.
Supreme confidence.
Right. But his men are already reaching their breaking point with these massive cultural shifts, and instead of stopping to consolidate his empire, Alexander's paranoia actually drives him further into the unknown. We are transitioning from military conquest to the messy reality of administration here.
Because ruling an empire is vastly different from conquering one. Alexander heads down into Egypt, where he is welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule. But he takes a dangerous detour deep into the Libyan desert, to visit the Oracle of Amun at the Siwa Oasis.
Right, and there, the high priest pronounces him the son of the deity Amun, which the Greeks equated to Zeus.
Zeus Amun. He even starts depicting himself on his own coins wearing the ram horns of Ammon. He's literally branding himself as a living god.
Then he marches back up, shatters the Persian army one final time at Gaugamela, and takes Babylon, Susa, and eventually the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, Persepolis.
And Persepolis is where the campaign takes a decidedly darker turn. After looting the immense wealth of the city, a fire breaks out in the eastern palace of Xerxes, and it spreads wildly, destroying much of the ancient capital.
The sources are really split on the why here, though. Some accounts claim it was a deliberate, sober act of revenge because the Persians under Xerxes had burned Athens over a century earlier.
Right.
But other historians, like Plutarch and Diodorus, suggest it was instigated by an Athenian woman named Thais during a massive drunken victory party, and that Alexander deeply regretted it once he saw the flames.
Yeah, whatever the true catalyst, it highlights a growing, impulsive, rash nature in his leadership. Darius is soon assassinated by his own satrap, which was essentially a regional Persian governor, a man named Bessus. With Darius dead, Alexander is the undisputed ruler of the Persian Empire. But he faces a profound administrative dilemma.
It's huge.
The Persian Empire is unimaginably vast and culturally complex. He realizes he cannot govern it effectively, using only a small, insular cadre of Macedonian generals.
So Alexander starts adopting traditional Persian dress. He introduces Persian nobles into his inner administration, and most controversially, he demands the practice of proskynesis.
What's fascinating here is proskynesis was the traditional Persian custom of showing respect to social superiors. Depending on rank, it involved bowing, prostrating oneself flat on the ground, or blowing a kiss. To the Persians, it was standard, polite court etiquette.
But to the Greeks and Macedonians, it was an absolute abomination.
Completely unacceptable.
Because in Greek culture, a free man only prostrates himself before a literal god. So when Alexander demands this from his oldest friends and veterans, they look at him and think, he actually believes his own hype. He thinks he's a deity.
But try to view it from Alexander's perspective, though. The elite administrative positions in this massive empire had always been held by Iranian noblemen. To keep the tax revenue flowing and prevent endless rebellions, he needed their support. Adopting their customs wasn't just him descending into megalomania, it was a highly pragmatic political necessity. He was attempting to bridge two vastly different cultures to forge a single unified ruling class.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's use an analogy to ground this for the listener. Imagine a brutal corporate merger. Your company just executed a hostile takeover of a massive rival firm. You and your team fought tooth and nail for years, working insane hours to beat them.
Blood, sweat, and tears.
Exactly. But the day after the merger is finalized, your conquering CEO suddenly starts wearing the rival company's uniform, promotes their executives to be your bosses, and demands you follow all of the rival company's bizarre HR policies. You'd be absolutely furious.
Oh, his Macedonian veterans were beyond furious. This cultural friction bred intense paranoia. Plots against Alexander's life start surfacing. One alleged conspiracy leads to the execution of his top cavalry commander, Philotas. And because of the ruthless, preemptive logic of ancient politics, Philotas's father, the legendary, deeply respected General Parmenion, is also assassinated on Alexander's orders.
Just simply to prevent him from taking revenge for his son.
Exactly.
The atmosphere becomes incredibly toxic. During a drunken argument in Samarkand, his general Clytus the Black, the man who literally severed a Persian's arm to save Alexander's life at the Battle of the Granicus, starts criticizing him openly. Clytus yells that Alexander has forgotten Macedonian ways in favor of a corrupt Oriental lifestyle.
And Alexander, blinded by rage and alcohol, grabs a spear and personally runs him through.
Which forces us to ask at what point practical management crosses the line into genuine paranoid megalomania, because Alexander begins to alienate and execute the very people who built his empire.
But he doesn't pause to reflect. He just keeps pushing further east. He becomes obsessed with reaching the ends of the world. He pushes them straight into India, which brings us to the ultimate breaking point.
Right, because the Indian campaign is fascinating, but Alexander's strategic brilliance isn't thwarted by a superior enemy tactician here.
No, it is thwarted by the absolute biological and psychological limits of human endurance.
In 326 BC, he faces King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes. It's a brutal, chaotic battle. The Macedonians are facing something that terrifies them, huge formations of war elephants. But Alexander analytically solves the problem on the fly. He orders his infantry to open their ranks. intentionally letting the charging elephants pass through the gaps.
It's so smart. Once the elephants are surrounded, the soldiers use their long sarissas to strike upward, targeting the unarmored handlers and the sensitive parts of the animals, driving them into a panicked frenzy.
It is a brilliant tactical adaptation. He is actually so impressed by how fiercely King Porus fought that he restores Porus's kingdom to him, making him an ally and a local governor.
And around the same time, his beloved horse, Bucephalus, finally dies of old age and battle fatigue, and Alexander founds a city on the spot, naming it Bucephala.
But the army has reached its limit. They get to the Hyphasis River, which is the modern-day Beas River, and they start hearing rumors from locals about what lies further east across the Ganges, the Nanda and Gangaridai empires.
And the intelligence they gathered was staggering. The Macedonian soldiers were told these eastern kings were waiting for them, with 80,000 horsemen, 200,000 foot soldiers, and 6,000 war elephants.
6,000 elephants. They had just barely survived fighting a couple of hundred against Porus.
Yeah.
The army straight up mutinies. They drop their weapons and refuse to take another step east. One of his senior generals, Coinus, pleads with him in front of the men. He tells Alexander the soldiers are exhausted, their armor is rotting off their bodies, and they just long to see their parents, their wives, and their homeland one last time.
The psychological toll of a 10-year nonstop military campaign, marching thousands of miles from home, had finally hit a wall. Alexander is furious. He locks himself in his tent for days, sulking, waiting for them to change their minds. When they don't, he finally relents and orders the army to turn south.
Think about this as the ultimate workplace burnout. You can have the most visionary boss in the world, a literal genius who has never lost a campaign in his life. But if they haven't let you see your family in a decade and now they're asking you to clock in on a Monday and fight 6,000 war elephants, you're going to quit.
Exactly. And Alexander's reaction to this forced retreat reveals a lot about his state of mind. Instead of taking the safest route back, he leads a large portion of his army through the Gadrosian Desert in southern Pakistan. It is a grueling, almost suicidal route.
Why go that way?
Well, the heat was unbearable, water was scarce, and sudden flash floods in the wadis washed away much of their baggage train, including women and children. Countless men die of thirst and exhaustion. Some historians actually argue this march was Alexander consciously punishing his army for their mutiny.
Wow. When he finally staggers back to Susa with the survivors, he tries one last massive attempt at cultural engineering. He holds a mass marriage ceremony where his senior Macedonian officers are wed to Persian noblewomen. He's literally trying to breed a new joint Macedonian-Persian elite to run his empire.
But the societal cracks are too deep to fix with a wedding. His Macedonian veterans mutiny again at Opis, furious that he is giving Persians high-level command posts and traditional Macedonian military titles.
Naturally.
So he has to violently suppress the ringleaders, then immediately pivots to throwing a massive banquet of reconciliation. It's a highly volatile, chaotic style of leadership driven by a man who is increasingly detached from reality.
And the story reaches its sudden climax when Alexander travels to Ecbatana. His closest friend, his cavalry commander Hephaestion, falls ill and dies.
The source material makes it clear that Hephaestion's death completely devastated Alexander. He orders an insanely expensive funeral pyre to be built in Babylon and institutes a strict period of public mourning. His grief was absolute, and it likely contributed to a rapid decline in his own physical health and immune system.
Because just a short time later, back in Babylon, while obsessively planning a massive new naval invasion of Arabia, Alexander himself falls ill. It's June 323 BC. He develops a severe fever after a night of heavy drinking. Over the course of 12 days, he gets weaker and weaker until he can't even speak. His soldiers, panicked and grieving, are allowed to file past his bed as he just silently waves at them. And at age 32, the conqueror of the world dies.
The exact cause of his death has been heavily debated by historians and medical experts for over 2 millennia. The ancient sources frequently suggest poisoning, perhaps orchestrated by his sideline general Antipater, using something like white hellebore or even toxic water collected from the river Styx.
But modern medicine has looked at the symptoms and proposed other theories, right?
Yeah, a gradual 12-day fever leading to paralysis doesn't cleanly fit the profile of most ancient poisons, which usually acted quickly. Modern retrospective diagnosis points toward natural causes like typhoid fever, malaria, West Nile virus, or even Guillain-Barré syndrome. When you compound any of those with years of heavy drinking, severe recurring battle wounds, and immense psychological stress, his body simply gave out.
The real tragedy, though, isn't just his death. It's the state he left the world in. When asked on his deathbed who this massive, fragile empire should go to, he allegedly whispers, "To the strongest." Or perhaps they misheard him, and he actually said, "To Craterus," his trusted general. Either way, it unleashes absolute disaster.
It is the ultimate failure of a monarch. He focused entirely on conquest and left no clear, legitimate adult heir. His wife Roxana was pregnant, but an unborn child cannot rule. The power vacuum was instantaneous. His top general is known in history as the Diadochi, which translates to the successors immediately turned on each other.
And the vast empire he spent a decade violently piecing together instantly shattered.
Completely. It led to decades of brutal civil war among the Diadochi, eventually fracturing the territory into three main kingdoms. You get Ptolemaic Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in Syria and Persia, and Antigonid Macedonia.
So what does this all mean? The guy conquers the world, and it falls apart the second he stops breathing. It forces the question, was it all for nothing?
Politically, his specific empire collapsed. But culturally, Alexander permanently changed the trajectory of human history. He inaugurated what we call the Hellenistic period, a deep blending of Greek culture with the cultures of the Middle East and Asia. He founded over 20 cities, most famously Alexandria in Egypt, which became a beacon of global knowledge.
Oh, absolutely.
And he established Greek as the lingua franca, the common language of the known world, a linguistic dominance that lasted in the East through the Byzantine Empire until 1453.
He physically forced East and West into contact. He inadvertently set the cultural and logistical stage for the Roman Empire, for Hellenistic Judaism, and even for Greco-Buddhism in India.
His enduring legacy isn't a unified political state. It's a unified cultural sphere. He forced the world open in a way it had never been before.
But I want to leave you, the listener, with a final mind-bending thought about where this was all headed if his body hadn't failed him. Before he died, Alexander had written down his last plans, which were preserved and recorded by the historian Diodorus. And these plans were so wildly extravagant that his surviving generals literally held a vote to ignore them.
They were staggering in their ambition, pushing the limits of what was technologically possible.
He planned to build a fleet of 1,000 massive ships to invade Carthage and conquer the entire western Mediterranean. He wanted to finance an expedition to completely circumnavigate Africa. He wanted to build a monumental tomb for his father, Philip, that would literally rival the Great Pyramids of Egypt in scale.
Unbelievable.
And most intensely, he planned to forcibly transplant entire populations, moving massive groups of people from Asia into Europe and Europeans into Asia to force cultural unity and peace through intermarriage.
The sheer scale of social engineering, geographic exploration, and endless conquest he was planning is almost unfathomable.
So think about this. If a microscopic bacteria, or a single mosquito, or a poisoned cup of wine hadn't stopped him in that sweltering palace in Babylon at age 32, what would the world map look like today? Did Alexander the Great die at exactly the right time to save the world from an unstoppable megalomaniac? Or were we robbed of a truly unified ancient world?